Starting a new series this morning in the book of Esther. The book of Esther. Why would I want to take you to the book of Esther? How many of you are super familiar with the book of Esther? Some of you are probably going to be super familiar with Esther, and some of you are going to say, I don't even know where it is. That's okay, I'll tell you where it is. Not a problem. That is actually really common because if for the Jewish cultures, they actually read the book of Esther during a festival. That's mentioned at the end of the book of Esther. So they're used to hearing this story over and over and over again. On the other side, the book of Esther does not mention someone in the book. Anybody know who is not mentioned in the book? God. God's not mentioned in the book. And so for that reason, some people typically don't read the book of Esther. I think the book of Esther is great. And the reason why I want to show you the book of Esther is because it really shows us God's providence. You may wonder, what is God's providence? It's a big word for me. Well, let me give you a little definition here. Providence is God's activity throughout history in providing for the needs of human beings, that would be you, especially those who follow him in faith. And so if you're a Christian here, he has a special focus in providentially providing for you, because what he's providing for is to fulfill his promises. That's what he's getting after. Now, God's absent from the book. Doesn't mean he's not there. Have any of you ever had a backstage pass somewhere? Yeah, there's one. How about anybody work in like theater, and instead of being on the stage, you work behind the scenes? Okay, there's another one. Yeah, a few more. Okay, a little more familiarity. So when there's a theatrical production, there's an entire crew that is on the stage that you're not to see. Typically the stage has curtains that are all black. And the stage crew, as they're called, they will wear all black. That's so they can get around and manipulate the stage sets, pyrotechnics, even some different lighting, having everything to do to make the play what the play is supposed to be. But as an audience member, you're not to see them, and you never do. It doesn't mean they're not at work. They're actually doing a lot, and if they weren't doing what they were doing, you would not see what you're seeing on the stage. That's the way we see God in the book of Esther. So I've labeled this sermon Backstage Pass, a behind-the-scenes look at God's providence. I wasn't fully in sync with where we were going this morning. Parachutes is here, Bob is here, testimonies of what God's doing in Anchorage, around the world. Okay, awesome stuff. What about in your own life? That's where it gets a little harder to see it sometimes, doesn't it? In your own life. Sure, you might be able to look back. You know, hindsight's 20/20, they say. And it's really clear to you, or maybe somebody else will point it out to you. Sometimes in the thick of the moment. You might even be sitting here today. I hear these great testimonies of God doing things, and I don't know where he is. There's things going on in my life that doesn't seem like he even knows. But what about you? What about that scenario? When you don't quite see him working in your life clearly? Well, the book of Esther's written for you then, because that's what we're going to see. What if you find it hard to see God working in your life? What if you wonder if, because I still struggle with sin, maybe God's not going to work in my life? Or maybe you wonder that, do my everyday decisions, do they really matter to God? Do they really have impact, the decisions I make on a daily basis? Well, what we're going to see is that the main character is sometimes behind the scenes. So we're going to dive right into the book of Esther. There are some rather complicated pronunciations, so I apologize for my English. English is not my strong language to begin with, so it's not going to be pretty, but we're going to make it through. If you want to get to Esther, to go to Psalms. You probably know where Psalms is, and then go back through Job and back to Esther. Okay, back towards the front cover. Psalms, back into Job, back in Esther, you'll find it that way. All right, I want you to follow along in the text this morning, beginning at verse 1. We're going to be dealing with a king named Xerxes. Your Bible may have a different name. You may have Ahasuerus. Xerxes is the Greek name for Ahasuerus. So if you have Ahasuerus, that's totally fine. You're also going to run into another one right there in the first sentence, that we have the town of Cush. Okay, you might actually have Ethiopia. All right, it's fine. We're going to see this as you go through the entire time. So if you run across a different word, no problem. Just take it that the NIV that we're using on the screen is giving a little bit more definition to what you might have. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. After that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet, lasting 7 days, in the enclosed garden of the king's palace, for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were there in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material, to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on the mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zahar, and Karsus, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in the matters of the law and justice, he spoke with some wise men who understood the times. They were the closest to the king: Karshena, Sthezar, Admatha, Tarshish, Mares, Marsina, Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to the law, what must be done with Queen Vashti? He asked. She has not obeyed the command of the king Xerxes that the eunuchs had taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against the nobles and the people of all the provinces of Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will be known to all women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond with all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end to disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, as did the king Memucan proposed. he sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each provinces on its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his household using his native tongue. Now, right in verse 1 and 2, we get some contextual things you need to take a look at. You can get a really clear picture if you actually go to the last page of 2nd Chronicles. All right, and you'll really get a good account of what's going on. Remember that God's people, when they were a nation in Jerusalem, they began to ignore God. And so after there was no hope left, God's anger and his wrath were aroused. And so what happened was that God allowed the Babylonians to come in and conquer Jerusalem. And just not that, but then Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. Okay? You might remember this from the time of preaching through the book of Ezra. So what we have here is God's disobedient remnant people exiled to Babylon into the Persian kingdom for 70 years. Why is this important? I want you to understand that the people we're reading about here are living in a pagan culture, a secularized culture. Okay? You should be able to relate with them very well. Strangers and exiles living in a foreign land. All right? In Ezra, we saw that King Cyrus, he helps some of the exiles return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And then you have the book of Esther taking place because not everybody returned. Some of the remnant stayed in Persia here. And then, as you may know, Nehemiah goes to rebuild the walls. And so that sort of places Esther between Ezra and Nehemiah. The temple being rebuilt. These people are staying in Persia. Meanwhile, there's building going on that Nehemiah will complete later in Jerusalem. So God's people are exiled, living in a foreign land. That's what we need to take note of. I'm going to introduce you to the 4 characters of chapters 1 and 2. And that's what I want to do today. It's very introductory in a lot of ways for us to understand how we're going to walk through the rest of the series. So I want you to understand what's going on with King Xerxes here. It's the first one on your note sheet, King Xerxes. Maybe you've noticed, just in the reading, if you haven't already, when you get to chapter 2, you certainly will, that what you see is not what you get when it comes to King Xerxes. Okay, what you see is not what you get. His greatness deflates to weakness, and though he has the power of a crown, he acts like a clown. That's pretty good, right? You will see it. You will see it. We've all been guilty of acting like clowns from now to then, and he definitely does. In verses 4 through 9, you got to see his greatness. I mean, 180 days of entertainment. I don't know about you, but I could not keep you entertained for 180 days. I just don't have enough cool stuff, I guess. But he was able to pull it off. 180 days with these people, keeping them entertained. Then, after maybe they leave with the people that hosted them of the citadel there, he has a 7-day feast for them. All right? The cherry on top. And check this place out. Gold and silver couches, mosaic pavement. I'd go for that right now in mud season, right? Not have to deal with that. I mean, this is a pretty high-class situation here. And there's an open bar in verses 7 and 8. All right? Now, why does the author point this out? The author wants you to be in awe and wonder of King Xerxes. You'll find out later, I think, why. He's got the power. He's got the wealth. He's the guy you want as your friend. And it gets worse and worse from there. You get to verses 10 and 12, and you see that his greatness deflates to weakness. In verse 10, he's drunk. In verse 11, he wants to display his trophy wife. And in verse 12, Vashti refuses. This is a public embarrassment. May not be a big deal to you if your wife doesn't do something that you ask her to do, but this is huge right here for him. He was probably saying, hey, I'm going to bring my wife out. She looks really good. You have to see how beautiful my wife is, right? He's gloating to everybody that's there. And she doesn't come. Public disgrace. He's embarrassed. He's gone from greatness, this powerful and rich man, to weakness, even his own wife. will not obey his word. From greatness to weakness. And so Xerxes, enraged, I'm guessing Xerxes and Vashti, they probably did not have very good premarital counseling. Okay? Because it's not going well. And it only gets worse. I would not, you don't want to go to this book for moral conduct or premarital counseling. It's not the one. You get to verses 13 and through 22. This is where you get to see that though he has the power of the crown, he begins to act like a clown. This begins with having 7 counselors to help him through this. All right? And I basically would summarize what happens here is they put in place a repeal and replace wife act. All right? If Vashti isn't going to obey, I'm going to repeal her from being queen. I'm going to replace her with someone else. That's what they're going to do. What's interesting is that's what she's already done, really, not coming into his presence. And he says, well, I don't want you in my presence. That's kind of obvious, right? It's interesting that here, as this husband, he can't get his wife to respect him. And though he could go about this through a loving scenario, rather he goes through it through a law. So he has the power of the crown, but he's acting like a clown. Instead of going to Vashti with love, the way husbands ought to, he uses the law to take her out. See, with Xerxes, what you see is not what you get. All the power, none of the class. He has all the wealth. You want to be his friend, but you realize he's not who he really claims to be. Now, that's Xerxes. I want to introduce you to Esther and Mordecai. So turn your pages over to chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 1. We're going to read through verse 20. We're going to stop just shy of finishing the chapter. We'll do that next week. Esther chapter 2, verse 1. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm and bring all these faithful women to the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them all. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was a citadel of Susa, a Jew, the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shema, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, who he had brought up because she had neither father or mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge for the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem in care of Shuzgez, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal presence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any other of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday through the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Verse 19. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instruction, as she had done when he was bringing her up. So first, Mordecai, verses 5 through 7. What we see here is the author wants us to know that he is a Jewish man. Okay, so here he is. He's living in what we would call back then a post-Jewish culture. All right, post-Jewish culture. He grew up in exile. Maybe some of you younger ones would say you grew up in a post-Christian culture. Maybe some of you older ones would say the same thing. Maybe we give too much credit to the old past times. But what basically we need to realize is that he grew up in an opposing worldview. Like we'd say today, in a post-Christian culture. He grew up in a secularized society. One of the things that we get to see in the book of Esther is how God is at work even in those times. Even in those times where we might say things are not going well. Things look bleak as it concerns Christianity. It's one of the things we get to see in this book. The third character, Esther, or as she was known previously, Hadassah. Her parents died. Okay, it's very clear. And her cousin Mordecai has taken her into his home, raising her as his own daughter. The text note that she's pleasing to the eyes. It's very important to the story. We're going to see what happens next. In chapters 1 and going into 2, we realize that Xerxes goes from being an angry man to a lonely man. From an angry man to a lonely man. And so a search committee for a new queen is established. And in the nicest terms I can put it, the search committee is looking for young, beautiful, never married women. They're being recruited. Then they will all be given resources needed to enhance their youthful beauty. Lots of beautification going on. After a year's time, she would then have one date with the king. One blind date. And they're only going to see the king again at that point if he calls for her. It's got to go that direction. She cannot come back. He has to go to her. So each woman has one date to please the king, and the winner is going to be crowned the queen. That's the nicest terms. In reality, this is glorified human trafficking. That's what's going on. It's not a pretty picture. Pagan times, bad times are happening here. So Esther, she's young, she's beautiful, she's never been married, and so naturally she's recruited into this plan of finding a replacement queen. Mordecai, he's staying in contact with Esther by visiting the courtyard and told Esther to keep her Jewish family background a secret, which she does, even up to the last verse that we read. So Xerxes' date with Esther was the best out of all the one-night dates, apparently, because he does indeed call for her, puts a crown on her head, and makes her queen. They have quite the celebration. He declares a holiday. They have a banquet, and he gives gifts out liberally. All right? So all the while, However, Esther is actually listening to Mordecai. Now, we've gone 2 chapters, and a lot really has taken place if you're looking at scene changes and what's going on. But yet the author has not told us anything about how Mordecai and Esther feel about all this. Doesn't that disturb you a little bit? Right? I mean, don't you want the author to come in and say this was wrong, what Cersei was doing was wrong, and here's how they're feeling about this? The author doesn't do it. As much as we wish we knew their positions on what's taking place would be explicit, so we would know for sure, the author doesn't tell us, and I believe it's actually very intentional. As readers, we know how Xerxes feels about it, but we really don't care what Xerxes thinks about the scenario. We don't care about how he feels. But yet we're not told about Mordecai and Esther, how they're feeling. I think that's because the author, though he does not mention the 4th character, wants us to know very clear who the main character is. Who the main character is. The God working behind the scenes. The one you don't see on the stage. That's who the author wants us to see. And though God's not mentioned in this book, if we look closely, we can see God working out through his providence. That's why this book is so encouraging in your own life. If you're saying, I don't see him working. I feel like I've been abandoned. You're going to see it here. You're going to see it. You'll see it even more as we go through the book. But one of the things that maybe you don't know yet, but if you read ahead, you realize, or if you've read it, you realize that what took place in chapter 1 had to take place. God had to remove Vashti from her queen. A new queen needs to be put in place. Why? Because ultimately what's going on is Jesus coming to the cross. That's what's happening. It's a big, big story when you blow up the picture. And in chapter 2, this has to happen too. And 2 things have to be true for this story to come true, which is that Esther needs to be a beautiful woman and she needs to be Jewish. That's how it's going to set up the scene. So though we don't know that officially reading through, I want you to see that. I want you to see what God is doing. Okay? Spoiler alert, but you needed to know it. Okay? To be encouraged. But if you look closely, the author actually gives us a clue of God's working, especially in chapter 2. There's a word that's repeated 3 times. If you were to read through it in a rather normal pace, you'd actually pick it out. It's the word translated in NIV, favor. Favor. It's also grace. It's mentioned 3 times. First, with Haggai. It says in verse 9, you just circle these favors in this text here. It says that she pleased him and won his favor. And just not that, but she ends up winning everybody's favor in this area, because in verse 15 it says, Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Favor. And then the king's favor in verse 17. It says, and she won his favor. It's an important word. We talked about Israel. Israel is mentioned of having God's favor. Joseph, God's favor. It says in Psalm 48:11, for the Lord God is the sun and shield. The Lord bestows favor and honor. No good thing does he withhold from those who walk is blameless. God is doing this favoring that's taking place. Doesn't seem like that on the stage, but God has set this all up providentially. Everything that's taking place. So my main point this morning is that God is working. Even if you don't recognize his handiwork, he is working. He's working out his big plan, and he's working out his plan for you. That's our God. You need to know that he can even use evil. You study the book of Genesis, chapter 50, where we read about Joseph. It said about him, about his brothers, you planned evil against me. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. You see, the author of Esther keeps God's name behind the scenes, but that doesn't mean he's not working. In fact, this is actually more of maybe the normal situation for most of us. Yeah, there's times where God is working, and I mean, it's obvious. You'd have to be blind not to see him, his working behind the scenes. But most of the time, it's this hindsight. It's that 2020 afterwards that we see him. But he's at work. Maybe we don't know it until 2020 comes in focus afterwards, or maybe some things we won't even know till heaven, but we're going to see when we get there that God's been at work with every detail of our lives. And so this week, look for those clues. Look for those clues in your life. Maybe it wouldn't be exactly God's favor, but something like that, where you can say, can't mistake that, right? We don't have coincidences, do we? No. God is at work. And maybe even begin to look at each decision that you make as an opportunity to join God's providential work. The big decisions and the little ones too. Because the little ones that maybe seemed insignificant in chapters 1 and 2 actually have a big result. Psalm 37 verse 23 says, "A man's steps are established by the Lord, and he takes pleasure in his way. Though he falls, he will not be overwhelmed, because the Lord holds his hand." That verse encourages me. I put it up there on the screen with the Holman Christian Standard Bible. I think it emphasizes the heart of the verse, that God takes pleasure in this way. And even if you fail, maybe you feel like Mordecai and Esther, you're living in a pagan world, and so there's times that you fail utterly. And yet you need to see that God will use all of that in his providence. That's how big our God is. Way bigger than our mistakes. Many times we think about Romans 8:28. We know that all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. God seems absent in your life. You need to remember that God is providentially providing his promises to you. Verse 29 is a wonderful one. For those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Conformed to the image of his Son. Why? That he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. That is wonderful news. Wonderful news as we walk much like Mordecai and Esther in a world that maybe doesn't have much respect for God. And so as we read through the book of Esther, we're going to take great encouragement that indeed, even if we don't see it at times in our own lives, maybe it's easier to see it in other people's lives, that God is at work. And God's using you. And one day, we're going to see the entire plan unraveled. We're going to see for what it really is. The black curtains will be taken away, and you'll see all that God's been doing. Let's stand together and pray. Father, indeed, you are at work. Lord, I see you working mightily in the lives of people here in GlacierView, and it's astounding. Lord, we hear testimonies of what's going on in Parachutes and around the world with Bob and so many others. Lord, we know you're at work, yet sometimes it's hard to see it in our own life. Lord, it may be maybe not here in GlacierView, but as we look at our nation, maybe things don't look quite so good for the Christian worldview. Much like it wasn't so good for Mordecai and Esther. Getting harder to live out the Christian worldview in a post-Christian society. So Lord, I pray that we would take heart in seeing your handiwork, your providence working through chapters 1 and 2. Lord, that we would see how you were helping Esther find favor through her beauty and probably her charisma and her personality and the way she was brought up. Lord, all of that working out for your perfect plan, that indeed the Savior of the world would come, that we would have forgiveness of our sins, and Lord, that we would indeed be counted as brothers and sisters with Christ. Father, thank you so much. Lord, I pray that we would be intentional with maybe just sitting down and seeing and reflecting upon what maybe seem as queer coincidences in our lives, but are not. They're your providential handiwork. And Lord, maybe some tough things have taken place in life recently. Lord, that we would take hope in knowing that you can even use the evil for your own good. Lord, we're thankful for those truths. And Father, that we would look at our decisions every day. Decisions as an opportunity to join you in your providential work and what's going on in the entire world, the big picture, and in the small picture of our lives. Father, thank you for your love. In Jesus' name.